let's begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final lecture of our spring policy series here at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. Come hell or high water, and both seem to have arrived, the Kleinman team was determined to bring you this fabulous event, and I want to thank in particular Bill Cohen, who had to pull off more than his usual number of miracles in order to make this event happen. I'm Mark Allen Hughes, the faculty director of the Kleinman Center, and while we prefer gathering on Penn's campus in our beautiful energy forum, we are very pleased to have all of you gather remotely for this event and to fill this digital space well beyond the capacity of our standard room. Just a note for those of you dealing with this wet and windy spring weather, this image was intended to be an antidote to COVID-19, but now it's also hopefully an antidote somewhat to the thunderstorms and tornado watch that we're all under here in the Delaware Valley right now. But if anything does occur, and potentially a power interruption or otherwise, a recording of today's event will be available on our website tomorrow. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's lecture, perhaps our longest standing Penn colleague, one of our heroes, Cary Coglianese, the Edward B. Shils Professor of Law and Director of the Penn Program on Regulation at Penn's Cary Law School. Cary.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Really are in your debt for your tremendous leadership at the Kleinman Center. And it really is my great privilege and delight to introduce to everyone joining us on this day to our speaker. Hannah Wiseman is a visiting scholar at the Kleinman Center, and she is also, though, the attorney's title Professor of Law and the Associate Dean for Environmental Programs at Florida State University College of Law. She is one of the foremost authorities on energy, oil and gas, and environmental law in the United States. She's a prolific scholar and has written one of the leading textbooks in the area of energy and environmental law. Before turning things over to her, I just wanted to outline a bit about the format for today. Professor Wiseman will speak for 30 minutes, give or take, however that goes, that's fine. And then afterwards, there will be an opportunity for question and answers. Now, the way that will work is if you look down at the bottom of your window and activate it on Zoom, there's a little button for Q&A. And so I would ask that you type out your questions there, and then when we get to the question and answer period, I'll select from those to ask Hannah and have our discussion. So feel free to use the Q&A function at any time during the talk to pose questions, and we'll keep a queue that way. Now, the chat function is still available. It's open. You can use that for talking with each other or making conversation about the seminar. Feel free to do that. The Kleinman Center staff has asked me to let you know that anything that they find inappropriate, of course, will be removed, and you may be removed from the discussion. With that said, I really wanted to thank Professor Wiseman for taking the time to join us today on this remote format. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing about how we can combat climate change through regulatory relief. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thanks, Cary. And thanks to all of you for joining. And I want to thank Cary, Bill, Mark, and Angela for making this possible. I was supposed to be in Pennsylvania in person several weeks ago, but of course, everyone's plans have been upended, so I really appreciate your making this online format possible. So as Cary noted, the topic of today's presentation is how we can address climate change and other environmental issues associated with air pollution, especially power plants, through deregulation. And there are three ways in which I'm going to suggest deregulation can address this problem. But first, what is the problem? The problem, as everyone knows, is Climate change is real now. We're seeing it in California with the Camp Fire in 2018, 85 deaths, 18,000 structures burned. The 2019 Kincaid Fire in Sonoma County in California had similar effects. And around the country with flooding and sea level rise, of course in Florida, we're worried about losing many of our coasts. The effects of climate change are increasingly apparent. But if anyone's not so worried about climate change, that's a shrinking number of people, but for those who aren't, I think there's another good reason to move toward renewable energy, and that is the more conventional air pollutants emitted from coal-fired power plants and to a lesser degree, natural gas-fired plants. A study from the University of Washington published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology noted that there are 16,000 premature deaths in the United States each year just from power plant pollution, from the conventional air pollutants emitted from power plants, especially the fine particulate matter that is prevalent in coal, where coal plants are located. This has quite negative effects. So there are reasons, in addition to climate change, to move toward this solution, which is renewable energy. It's of course not the only solution to climate change and air pollution. We need a suite of solutions. The largest contributor to air emissions in the United States, carbon emissions as well as other air pollutants, it's transportation, not power plants. A few years ago, cars and trucks moved ahead of power plants in terms of being the highest polluters. Not a great distinction to have, but there it is. So 36% of our carbon pollution comes from transportation, 35% from power plants. So if we are going to take the climate threat and the air pollution threat seriously, we're going to need to electrify the vehicle fleet, and we're going to need to produce more electricity because of that. And the electricity is going to need to come increasingly from renewable sources, or depending on one's perspective and willingness to pay for it, nuclear energy. So this is my proposed solution is, as many people's proposed solution. It's what the Clean Power Plan under the previous presidential administration would have moved us toward. And it's what we're actually moving toward anyway, in part. Now, maybe not quickly enough, but one of the reasons why renewables have started to really take off in the United States has nothing to do with all the subsidies that they have recently had. The subsidies have helped a great deal. But there's been another major driving force, and that is restructuring of wholesale electricity markets, what some people call deregulation. Now, it's not full deregulation. What the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has done is it has tried to get rid of the balkanized transmission grid, all the electric transmission lines that are required to transport electricity throughout the United States. As you can see in the white areas in the United States, here's where the grid is still relatively balkanized. Meaning, even if you have a regionally connected grid, it's very hard to get your electricity from one point to another on that grid. So if I wanted to send electricity from Florida up here to these other southeastern states, or even into the Midwest, I would have to my electricity would go across many different transmission lines with many different rates called pancaked rates. And it would essentially just be quite difficult. In these colored areas, which are called regional transmission organizations, these are where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has persuaded utilities to join an integrated grid with competitive wholesale electricity markets. And these have been major drivers of renewables. These renewable transmission organizations, by offering the competitive wholesale electricity markets, have given these renewable generators an outlet for their electricity that they would not otherwise have had. And because they can more easily transport the electricity long distances, they have more customers. The other thing the RTOs have done is they've helped with transmission planning. So the Southwest Power Pool, which, let me go back to the previous slide for a moment. The turquoise here, Oklahoma, other Midwestern states, goes a little bit up into the Dakotas and Montana. 2019 in October had a record day. Almost 75% of the electricity flowing through the Southwest Power Pool came from renewable energy, solar, wind, and water. You're not seeing this in parts of the United States where we don't have competitive wholesale electricity markets. Simply not happening. So the deregulation, in a sense, has helped to drive renewable energy development, in addition to the very important regulatory mechanisms that states have used, such as renewable portfolio standards. However, there's a second barrier that I argue needs to be overcome through partial deregulation. And that is very strong resistance to renewable energy from communities that are hosting the renewable energy or potentially hosting it, and nonprofit groups. Now, many environmental groups are quite supportive of renewable energy. In fact, I'd say most of them are, especially the national ones. But David Spence from the University of Texas has a very interesting empirical study of the opposition to renewable energy, and it's finding that it's not just the communities themselves, citizens groups, it's also local environmental groups. In some cases, the local branches of national environmental groups are taking a different stance and opposing renewable projects. And now it's understandable why they are, because renewable energy has very powerful impacts at the local level, aesthetic impacts, noise. Some people don't like the sound of the turbines. They're not always all that loud, but depending on the weather, they can be. Some people complain of the shadow flicker from the moving turbine blades. And of course, during construction, there's dust and there are air emissions from the diesel equipment. So renewable energy has powerful impacts, and communities understandably oppose it. This is a town near where I grew up in New Hampshire, so not quite as far from you as Florida. It's called Antrim, New Hampshire. This is a completed wind project. It finally took off in 2019. The blades started spinning, some of them in 2019. You see one on the right that's still under construction. But it took more than 10 years to get a few of these turbines up on the mountain. And this is a very small wind project. Now, you might say it's because of politics. So if you look at Antrim, it's down here on southwest New Hampshire, this little black outline. Even though New Hampshire as a whole voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election, just by a hair, Antrim is more Republican. So you might say, well, can't we just attribute the opposition to wind to politics? That's not the case. Despite Antrim being Republican in a sea of blue in that part of New Hampshire, there is a lot of green sentiment in Antrim and the surrounding towns. People like renewable energy in theory, but when it's in their community, they don't like it so much. So this is why you see it taking at least 10 years to get just a few turbines on the mountaintop. It's not just politics. Here's just a very small sampling of some of the recent bans or moratoria on wind energy or solar energy or both, including in California, which is many of you probably think of as a leader in renewables, which it is. Texas is the leader in wind energy, but California is right behind, and it's also a leader in solar. But San Bernardino County, California said, we've had enough. It had already had several wind and solar farms built. They didn't want more. And so they banned large renewable projects in the county and in many parts of the county. You also see bans in Kansas, North Carolina. There have been several solar bans, and small towns in New York as well. For many years, there have been moratoria or bans, or sometimes just individual permit denials of a large proposed renewable facility. And again, this is just a smattering. I'm sure there are examples from Pennsylvania. I didn't pull one from Pennsylvania today, but maybe some of the commenters have examples of opposition to renewables in communities. Now, again, I'm not saying this is irrational or all bad. I very much understand why communities are concerned about the impacts of renewable energy, but I think there needs to be a middle ground. And then there's a third barrier, and this is federal and state environmental regulation, among many other types of regulation of renewable energy, as well as private parties using these federal and state statutes to delay projects in court. Now, this is a tactic that's been used for many years for all sorts of things: highway projects, pipelines. It's being used right now for pipelines, oil and gas wells. Environmental groups, citizens groups will find a statute to their advantage, and they'll go to court and they'll say, we think the federal agency's approval of this project failed to follow the terms of the statute or was arbitrary and capricious under the Federal Administrative Procedure Act. And this serves to delay the project if not kill it altogether. And this is being used not just against pipelines, oil and gas wells, et cetera, it's being used against renewables, this approach. Cape Wind, the first major proposed offshore wind project in the United States, had the unfortunate position of being the leader in attempting to plow through the many regulations that apply to offshore wind energy. They were part of every test case there could potentially be for offshore wind. There will probably be more, but there were many, many cases here. There were arguments that even the grant for the meteorological tower, just the little tower offshore, and this was off of Nantucket Sound, that would have tested the amount of wind. There's a great deal of opposition to that, saying that there should have been state approval under the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act, because the state had to comment on the impacts of the meteorological tower on its fisheries. Now, ultimately, all of these cases, there was also a case involving Nantucket Sound being a protected cultural site under National Historic Statutes. So the Department of the Interior had to go through consultation to reduce the impacts on that cultural site. The Coast Guard was a little bit concerned about vessels coming to and from that area. The Federal Aviation Administration thought that the wind turbines were going to the towers and turbines were going to interfere too much with airline traffic. So I have a whole list here. I won't read through it. There were many, many challenges. Ultimately, Cape Wind won every single one, but at that point, it had been from 2002 to 2017, and they gave up. They said, even though we've won everything, we've gotten, in the meantime, they were getting grants to try to continue the project, even as they were having to fight all this in court. Project was abandoned in 2017. So I think an important solution here, both to address the community opposition and the federal and state regulation, is to find some sort of balance. It doesn't make sense to cause environmental deterioration and destruction that's unnecessary while plowing forward with renewable projects. But I think there's a way to still protect the wildlife that we're concerned about, and the soil, the water quality, and also streamline the process a bit such that these projects can be approved and the very large impacts of climate change and conventional air pollution can be reduced. Now, the most extreme approach is just exempt the industry from certain statutes. Oil and gas enjoys several large exemptions. Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is disposal of substances on land. Most oil and gas wastes, even if they're toxic, are not subject to hazardous waste regulation under RCRA, which is why you can see this picture of an open pit with some oil and gas waste in it. That's why they can do that. They wouldn't be able to store oil and gas waste in open pits if they didn't have that RCRA exemption from Subtitle C, or they would have to be much more diligent about it. Many of you probably heard about the Halliburton Loophole. This is an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act, which would normally require oil and gas operators to guarantee that they would not endanger underground sources of drinking water when conducting hydraulic fracturing. They're exempted from that. So we could do that for renewable energy as well. We could also just preempt local control to a great extent, which is what's happening for oil and gas. Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, Louisiana, New Mexico, a number of other states have tried to and have effectively done this project of preempting local governments from regulating most aspects of oil and gas. The same has not occurred so much for renewable energy. There is a growing amount of preemption. There's more centralization of siting, but local governments still tend to have more input in the renewable context. I don't think we necessarily need these extreme approaches, but there are other approaches where you still apply all of the relevant statutes, you still allow local control, but you try to speed up the approval process. One is to pre-select a site where the renewable energy will go, because much of the environmental review, the litigation, and the agency review relates to the use of the land. Renewable energy is very land intensive, so there are questions about endangered species, there are questions about migrating birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, impacts on wetlands, or in the desert, impacts on the desert tortoise. So what you can do is you can have a federal agency help out with that, review the potential impacts, and select in advance the sites that will be best for renewable energy. This was done under the Obama administration for renewables on federal lands. It's called SMART from the start. New York, Governor Cuomo recently proposed a similar strategy. in which build-ready projects would be identified. The idea would be identify any potential resource conflicts or regulatory conflicts, find the lands that have the fewest of those conflicts, get them pre-permitted so that they're pretty much ready to go. The developer would just have to purchase the site in an auction and then start building. That's the proposal in New York. California has something a little bit similar through its natural community conservation planning, where it looks at potential regulatory issues in advance, clears those issues, and then says, here are some sites for renewable energy. Other ways to deregulate to some extent, only partially, you still apply the statutes, the federal environmental statutes, but you have agencies consolidate or collaborate. And you can do this, the many federal agencies with authority over a project can be consolidated within one agency, or they can just work together so they don't require the same submission of data over and over. Or you can have state agencies and federal agencies collaborate, as they are doing in Oregon. The Bureau of Land Management and the Oregon Renewable Citing body, they get together and try to reduce the regulatory burdens on developers. New York has proposed one office that would consolidate all of the review. This is also part of Governor Cuomo's recent proposal. California has its Fish and Wildlife Service and its Department of Energy get together and team up so that developers don't have to submit duplicative information. You can also require agencies to approve projects more quickly. Now that, of course, you might not have as much public input as you want if you speed up the process too much, so it's a fine balance. Or you can provide applicants with support, help them navigate the regulatory process through things as simple as regulatory checklists, or you can have an official within the agency or an outside ombudsman help the applicants through the process. Last slide, I want to hear from all of you. I think that we've got to be incredibly cautious, though, if we're going to propose that renewables should have a benefit from massive deregulation or even just streamlining. There are major environmental justice concerns here. Renewables are land intensive, and we don't want the communities that have already had to host the bulk of energy burdens picking up even more burdens without adequate input. And we need procedures and we need support for these communities to be able to participate in a meaningful process. We also need new regulations, which states are recognizing, because as we transition rapidly to renewable energy, we will need statutes providing for support for all of the workers who are losing their jobs. New Mexico is one of the best examples of this, providing pension support, retraining, unemployment payment, and for coal workers who are losing their jobs, as well as investment in the communities that are losing coal mines and coal-fired power plants. New Mexico, Washington State, several other states have just transition statutes. More states will need these, though. New York is proposing to even pay the communities who will be hosting the renewable development. They will get breaks on their utility bills. Just one other note of caution, when you move forward rapidly with anything, especially an infrastructure intensive project, you risk creating path dependency that's negative. So maybe we don't need all these new transmission lines or centralized renewable power plants. A recent national study suggests 39% of our electricity could come from rooftop solar. There are that many rooftops already open. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a survey, GIS-based, of all the roofs, and said based on the open rooftops in the United States, we could be getting almost 40% of our energy from the rooftop option. So we don't want to risk entrenching too much centralized renewable energy. And what about energy efficiency and other ways we could be addressing these same problems? So there's just some thoughts on the cautionary aspect of this, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Oh, wonderful, Hannah. Thank you very much for that excellent review of regulations that might be standing in the way of renewable energy. I would invite anybody who's joining us on the internet connection to type in your questions on the Q&A portion of Zoom. If you scroll down to the bottom of your window, there will be a button that opens up that says Q&A, and I'll draw questions from that in a moment. I do want to ask a couple of questions myself to get things started. And I wondered, Hannah, if you could talk about other types of regulation. I think probably I'm not alone in thinking that when I saw your title for your talk about regulatory relief and climate change, what seems so provocative is that I immediately thought about relief from regulations addressing climate change. So the Clean Power Plan, or for example, or other types of environmental regulations that would increase the costs for carbon intensive energy sources. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that as one aspect here. I mean, is this, are the kinds of regulatory burdens that you've been talking about ones that could be overcome if there were sufficient regulatory incentives to reduce carbon-based fuel in general?
Sure. So if we were really, if we're talking about broader deregulation and sort of getting the government out of the business of subsidizing renewables or requiring renewables, I think that the key would be to provide more regulatory support for the wholesale competitive markets that I talked about near the beginning. So if we really wanted to say, let's just forget about any federal climate regulation under the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act's not the best mechanism anyway. Let's just forget about it. I think you need a more serious effort to.
For sake of argument, right? I take it.
Yes, that's for sake of argument. I don't think we're nearly there. And in fact, there's essentially a mandate, right? After Mass v. EPA, the government, even the current Trump administration, is trying to a relatively weak rule, but still moving forward with it. Right. I think that the folks would have to be on the transmission aspect, because even though the regional transmission organizations that exist have been doing a great job for the most part, there are exceptions to that. So Shelley Welton has written a lot in this area. Shelley Welton at South Carolina was visiting at Stanford this semester, has written about how some of the RTOs in your area, your neck of the woods, have not always been so supportive of renewables. In fact, they've done a little bit to sort of subsidize coal within the markets. They've given coal an advantage within some of these competitive markets because of the way they're designed. So I think FERC, in terms of the incentives it's providing for RTOs and its approval of the design of these markets, as well as regional transmission planning, would need to do a lot more work to create a truly supportive market for renewables and ensure that they are able to bid into these markets in an equal way and access the customers they need to.
Well, on that note, we have a question from the audience that follows directly on this and asks if you could just further elaborate on how the restructuring actually helped facilitate the restructuring of the electricity market and its deregulation, if you will, the competition in the wholesale production. How did that? How does that actually helping to facilitate the development of renewable energy? Sure.
So prior to the restructuring of the market, so some of the major restructuring occurred under a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission order in 1996 called FERC Order 888, which required open access to the grid. And around the same time, FERC had issued other orders in addition to having to open up the transmission grid so that any generators who wanted to use it could get on the grid. At the same time, FERC was allowing generators of electricity to start charging rates that were set by the market rather than rates that were set by FERC in the wholesale market. So this made it more like a regular market where you could just go out and sell your goods without having to first get agency approval. Now this is restructuring, it's not deregulation, because FERC was still closely monitoring these sales, not monitoring them enough because we saw what happened with Enron. But FERC was trying to closely monitor these sales and ensure that there was still some government oversights of these markets, especially because transmission, even if you open it up and require utilities to allow all generators onto the line, it's still a monopoly in many ways. So the competitive markets were helpful to renewable generators because now they did not just have to rely on a long-term power purchase agreement to get assurance that they would be able to make money. So previously, renewable generators had to enter into something like a 20-year contract with a purchaser, or otherwise it wouldn't be worth building. Some renewable generators, now they're competitive markets with a price, just whatever the market would bear, could sell a good deal of their energy into those markets. I believe that there were some renewable companies that primarily relied on selling in the spot market, the sort of real-time energy markets, rather than PPAs. Other renewable developers still relied a lot on these power purchase agreements, plus the spot markets. So it gave renewable generators another market to play in, essentially. And then this opening up of the transmission lines and the regional connection was even more key, because it just allowed the transport of wind and solar energy from rural areas to the load centers where all the people are demanding the electricity. So you can now carry wind from Oklahoma throughout much of the Midwest, and that now the wind generators just have more of a market to access.
Can you, just to follow up on that too, are there state regulations that are still requiring that, or allowing at least utility companies to recoup their stranded assets in the old legacy energy sources that maybe should be revisited or rethought as well?
That's an interesting question. So yeah, in the retail electricity market, where the utilities purchase electricity wholesale, or they generate it and then they sell it to retail customers, the states are of course still regulating that aspect of the market. And the very interesting dynamic here is that even within these competitive RTOs, the regional transmission areas, even within those competitive areas, a lot of the states still regulate retail electricity. So yes, I think there is more to be done at the state level, because what a lot of states are doing is they're still requiring, if you want to build generation in the state, or if you want to purchase electricity from a renewable generator, you still have to go to the state and get approval for that. Or if you are a coal-fired power plant retiring in the state, the state will often have provisions still allowing you to recover the costs of those assets that have not reached the end of their useful life. So when Cary refers to stranded assets, it's when a retail utility or some other utility that had an obligation to serve customers had invested in infrastructure, and because of this transition to renewables, the infrastructure is no longer as useful, so it's having to be retired early. Now, if you allow full recovery of those stranded assets for coal-fired power, then ratepayers may say, well, we're not going to pay for renewable energy on top of paying for the stranded assets. So that is a concern. One approach New Mexico is taking that's somewhat interesting is New Mexico's Energy Transition Act. There's a bond mechanism for helping to cover some of these stranded costs. As I understand it, it's still ultimately on the ratepayers having to pay for the coal assets that are being retired early, but there's also a bond backing it up and taking some of the pressure off of the ratepayers. So yeah, there will need to be further attention at the retail level. I do want to mention that in some cases, retail regulation can support renewable energy though, because some states have changed the approval process for new generation. When states issue what's called a certificate of need to new generation, some states have changed the consideration process to make renewables have an advantage in that process. Ann Carlson has written a little bit about that. Very interesting work coming out of UCLA on that issue.
So a couple of questions here about states, just to build on this last conversation here. One question is, what are your thoughts on states like Connecticut that apparently are actively seeking to exit from competitive markets in order to pursue state-backed renewable energy procurements? And one other related question, it goes to your slide about where there are RTOs. Why is there no RTO in the Southeast United States? So those seem maybe connected in some way.
Sure. Some states, I think, are just not seeing enough support from the competitive market. They think that when so what happens in an RTO, the competitive wholesale market, is the RTO just takes all of the generators' bids, and there are several different markets. So there'll be a day ahead market, there'll be a 15-minute market, 15 minutes before the electricity will be flowing through the grid, then there'll be a real-time market. And the RTO just takes information on what how much electricity all of the utilities need, whether the utilities are in Connecticut or elsewhere. And then it takes the bids from the generators. It takes the cheapest bids first, and then in ascending order, it takes the next cheapest, et cetera, until there's a clearing price. And my guess, I haven't followed Connecticut in particular, but I know some other states that have been concerned about these markets, is they think that even though renewables are now quite cheap, just because the fuel is free, wind, it doesn't cost you anything to get the wind, and because there are now economies of scale in terms of constructing and operating wind and solar, it's cheaper, but it might not be cheap enough when it's competing with natural gas in some regions. So I think some states, if they're wanting to go 100% renewable and they want their utilities to be able to purchase 100% renewable, they may feel that they need a mechanism outside of those competitive markets. They need to be able to better control the electricity that's being acquired, not just on within the basic clearing price. Now, you could fix that problem in the competitive markets by creating environmental pricing mechanisms so that when the RTO got bids from generators, rather than just what price are you offering electricity at, they could put an adder on, or it would in fact reduce the price artificially if it were a renewable resource. But I believe some states think that RTOs aren't moving quickly enough on those sorts of alternative pricing mechanisms in markets. And they also might feel constrained by FERC. FERC has preempted several recent state efforts to encourage more generation. So when Maryland thought it needed more generation because it wasn't going to have enough electricity, and Maryland tried to guarantee that there would be more generation capacity in the future, the RTO said, no, you're preempted. We do that. We have a capacity market. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission agreed, and ultimately the US Supreme Court agreed. They said, no, this is a federal issue. And so if states are worried that they're going to be preempted in requiring certain amounts of renewable capacity, that might be another reason to exit. Just a quick note though, other states, and this will bridge to the Southeast, states like South Carolina are actively trying to access competitive markets now. So there have been proposals in South Carolina to join an RTO because there in South Carolina, they feel that they don't have enough access to these competitive, cheaply priced energy resources. And they're in the middle of a $9 billion boondoggle with their nuclear power plant. So the state public, forget if it's Public Utility or Public Service Commission in South Carolina, approved the construction of a new nuclear power plant, but it's about 40% done. It will never be completed. They've given up, and the ratepayers are now facing something like $9 billion in cost overruns. So people in South Carolina are saying, get us some energy from somewhere else. Now, it might not be as clean as nuclear energy would have been, right? But they're worried about, largely about the price tag they're seeing there. Why does the Southeast not have an RTO? As I understand it, it's because most of the states in the Southeast are very, very traditionally regulated. So in Florida, you can't even build merchant generation here if you're coming from out of state. It's probably a dormant commerce clause violation, never been fully tested. But we have essentially blocked, we're so focused on treating electricity as a natural monopoly that we've essentially blocked out-of-state competitive generation. It's very, traditional. If you want to build, you get approval from the Public Service Commission, you get approval of your rate, and that's what we do. That's what many of the southeastern states do. And my understanding is they don't want to share their cheap energy with other people. So they don't want to give up their tight control over electricity markets within the state. They're worried that a move toward an RTO would move the states more toward restructuring and deregulation. And when I say they, I mean mostly utilities here. And then there are the concerns of, we don't want to export what is relatively cheap energy.
Okay, Dara asks a question about the MOPR rule and how it might be affecting clean energy adoption. Is that a rule you can explain to us?
Remind me, MOPR, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and without sleep, I can't remember a lot of acronyms. Dara, can you please remind me what the acronym stands for?
Yeah, can you type that out, Dara? The minimum offered price.
Oh, yes.
Minimum offered price rule. And, I guess she's wondering if other federal regulation or deregulation could fix the adverse effect on state and local efforts to try to promote clean energy.
Oh yeah, Dara, this is a really good question. And I could have answered this 2 weeks ago after I read that rule. I can't intelligently answer your question now. I'd like to have an offline discussion about it though, because after reading it, it made a lot of sense to me. But no, I don't want to just go on about it. But in terms of other, so the second half of the question though was,
well, just any other things that the feds could do, FERC in particular might do to try to
I think
allow states to encourage clean energy.
Yeah. I think FERC could do a lot. I think it could further expand its requirement that even in states without RTOs, there's a requirement coming out of FERC for regional transmission planning. So states like Florida are supposed to be getting together with utilities in other states and figuring out how to expand the transmission grid in a way that will make it more regional. And I just don't think that there's been enough sort of aggressive enforcement of that requirement. I think utilities are, especially in places like Florida, are taking that requirement pretty lightly. And if you really could get more regionalization, even in these areas where states are resisting the RTO, that would go a long way toward allowing states like Florida or others to at least import more renewables from elsewhere. But of course, FERC, whenever it attempts to even suggest mandatory regionalization, the states get really upset and they usually win the political battle. So it's tough. I think FERC could do more on the environmental pricing, and I think it could do more to monitor the activities of RTOs in sort of the Northeast Mid-Atlantic that, as Shelley Welton has pointed out, are probably doing too much to favor traditional energy resources and not enough to allow in the new renewables, not just in terms of pricing, but in terms of requirements for bidding and interconnection and whatnot. So I think FERC is all, just a quick side note, FERC has done a lot with sort of mandating uniform interconnection standards so that when these renewable generators try to connect to the transmission grid, they're not subject to more onerous terms than other generators. Although they have to be subject to different terms than other generators because of their intermittency. But there are ways to try to prevent too much in the way of blocking renewables in the interconnection process. And FERC has done a little bit there, but maybe it could do more.
Another question about federal regulation here. Are there perversities happening with some federal statutes or regulations that might be encouraging renewable resources into what the questioner, Brian, says are suboptimal places? For example, he's read that federal renewable fuel standard for automobiles, I guess, would encourage renewable fuels into transportation when regulation could actually be working in harder to decarbonize sectors.
Yes, I think the federal renewable fuel standard is a great idea of perversities. It's the first, I believe it's the first time Congress officially mandated a renewable. It's one of the first and only times, and that was the use of ethanol. And then later biofuels, not just ethanol, in gasoline. And that is, of course, incentivizing massive corn production in the Midwest. Many studies suggest it's still carbon neutral or even net positive in terms of reducing carbon, but other studies question that. And yes, I think that instead of requiring corn to be put in our fuel, perhaps incentives toward electrification of vehicles. I think the federal government could do a lot with the charging infrastructure that will be required on the federal highways. I think that's a good place for federal involvement, at least in the form of grants and coordination of planning efforts for those chargers. I'm trying to think of other perversities. There have been other perversities from state regulation because some of the states that are requiring relatively rapid moves toward 100% renewables aren't the states where they're very sunny or windy, and they will eventually need 100% renewables, and they're going to have to rely a lot on out-of-state support But I think, maybe some of those states should be thinking more about energy efficiency in addition to focusing on renewables. So there can be perversities at the state level as well.
Do you, a couple of questions about public participation. One question asks, how do local concerns get factored in, if at all, I guess, to the renewable energy development process if your streamlining proposals were put into place? Sure. Is there something that we're losing from having community input?
I think you lose a lot, and this is where it's hard to find the right balance. So there are several different models for citing renewable resources. One is to leave almost all control at the local level, which is what states like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas do. And their local governments get a large amount of input. They can ban the resource if they prefer to. They can zone it very carefully such that you don't have large industrial renewable development too close to residential areas. So they can use zoning tools, traditional regulatory tools. All of those tools are at their disposal, and there can be many public processes through the local land use regulation process. Then there is a hybrid approach. There are a couple of different hybrid approaches. So one is you have a centralized body that approves the siting of the large-scale renewable resource. This is what Washington and Oregon do, for example. But then you require that as part of that centralized, more streamlined approval process, there still has to be a review of whether that renewable energy infrastructure complies with local requirements. I think that still takes away some of the local participation though, because if people can't travel to the state's capital, they can't participate easily in that process now. So they might have to voice their concerns in other ways, and their concerns that there is not compliance with those local regulations. A third model is there's even less local participation, and that's where the state preempts local land use controls or any other form of control over renewable energy development. Wisconsin has done this to some extent. Wisconsin has placed a ceiling on local regulation, meaning local governments may not regulate more stringently than the state in terms of setbacks, how far a wind farm must be from a house, or noise levels. Now, local governments can sometimes justify regulating more stringently out of safety or uniquely local concerns. But there you essentially have the state saying, here's what we think the standard is, and if you're a resident who disagrees with the state standard and thinks it's not protective enough, too bad for you. So when you have these hybrid approaches that move things more toward the centralized state approval process, I think it takes away a lot from local participation in terms of, well, the local government is limited in what it may regulate, and also just it's harder for individuals at the local level to participate in this larger centralized state process in terms of traveling to that process, or you have to take more time off from work because now you can't just show up at the city council meeting in the evening. And those are problems that need to be thought quite carefully about. I think that you can have, maybe you could require the state agency to hold meetings in the community, which I believe some states do. This is something that EPA did with the Clean Power Plan that went around the country. It basically had a road show trying to hear people's concerns. Some people thought that still was not enough input in that federal law, but
well, it certainly didn't. It wasn't enough to head off opposition to it, was it?
No, it didn't work, but they tried. They put in a good effort. So those are just a few thoughts. And I really don't mean to trivialize them. I think local participation is essential here, and there are ways to somewhat streamline, but still make sure people have some say in the process.
Another member of the audience wonders if you could reflect on other countries. Is there another country that's been doing this well? What are the lessons abroad? And then another questioner, maybe to just follow on that, says, now bringing it back home, what is the political formula to make a movement toward more renewable fuels happen?
Okay, other countries, Many of you probably heard that Germany has a substantial amount of nuclear penetration, in part because Germany, as part of its Energiewende strategy, sorry, I can't pronounce German very well, it's had a couple of different energy plans called Energiewende, and it was moving away from nuclear and coal at the same time. And if you want to do that, if you want to move away from nuclear and coal, you have to rely a lot on renewables and natural gas. And Germany primarily used a feed-in tariff mechanism. A feed-in tariff, it's very different from what most states in the United States have used. Most US states have used a renewable portfolio standard, which just says a certain percent of electricity must come from renewables, or what they're now calling clean energy standards, some of which allow nuclear. Germany said, we will guarantee renewable energy developers a certain purchase price for their electricity, and we'll guarantee them an interconnection to the grid, meaning that's the feed in. They'll guarantee that they can sell their electricity through the grid at a price, and the tariff, the price, was designed to allow those developers to recover their costs. The idea was you're trying to guarantee them somewhat of a profit to incentivize development. There are, as you would imagine, there are people who think this was a great strategy because it provides for more investment certainty than a renewable portfolio standard does, but many have criticized it as being more expensive than it would have had to be because you're setting the price. And it's very hard to set prices at the right level, at a level that incentivizes development, but doesn't incentivize too far, right? Because in some cases, developers would have been building the renewable energy anyway, and you might be compensating more than you need to. So Germany did have a mechanism for ratcheting down the price, the tariff, over time, but many people say it wasn't ratcheted down quickly enough. And prices did go up, the prices for electricity.
Was that a national, Germany is a federal government
Yes.
too.
It was a national energy plan, which is also different from the United States because we have relied on state-by-state renewable portfolio standards. Now, what's really interesting is even without a federal renewable portfolio standard, we are now moving more aggressively toward renewables, partly because so many states have just decided to move ahead anyway with some form of incentive, and also because of wind just being very cheap now. We're experiencing economies of scale from the prior subsidization of wind. Okay, so what would be the political formula here? I wouldn't suggest necessarily a national feed-in tariff. If you want to see a very interesting article suggesting some combination of state renewable portfolio standards or feed-in tariffs, as well as some federal support along those lines. Felix Mormon writes in that area. He has a great article in the Florida Law Review about a combination sort of cooperative federalism approach to renewables, where you would have some top-down federal determinations about how many renewables we needed, but maybe you'd have the states figuring out what price would be needed to incentivize them. That is one option. But I think other approaches we would need as part of a political formula, we do still need monetary support for renewables, even though they increasingly outcompete coal and nuclear naturally, just because they're cheap. We still need more financial support. I think we would need to extend current federal tax incentives for solar and wind and other renewables. So the production tax credit, which provides a tax credit per kilowatt hour of electricity produced, and the investment tax credit, which provides federal money when you put the renewable infrastructure in place. Those are scheduled to run out in the next year or so. I think we would need renewal of those federal tax support mechanisms. So I don't think, I'm not even sure that the Clean Power Plan, reviving that would be the best way, having this federal top-down requirement. But I think having the federal support is really important. And then I think, as mentioned, I think we need more federal involvement in terms of directing FERC to get more serious about the regionalization of the grid. One more area where we need federal involvement is transmission line siting. Currently, the states can block new transmission lines, even ones that run interstate. Congress, in the recent Energy Policy Act, tried to provide some ways for the federal government to intervene when states were blocking new transmission lines too much, but the federal circuit courts interpreted that statute such that it has no teeth. So there's currently not really a way for the federal government to override a state from saying, we don't want this transmission line that's going to run through the state and provide renewable energy somewhere else. I'm hesitant to say there should be an all-out federal override because I understand why states don't like transmission lines. I think we need to move more toward distributed energy as well. But I think there might need to be a little more federal state involvement in the transmission siting process.
Well, last question here, I think goes to Andy Humler here, and builds on this concern about politics. The workers who will be displaced as we transition toward a renewable energy grid. Can you talk a little bit more about the pensions you mentioned, or the financial support? Does the payment of the $1,200 COVID checks set a precedent that might be picked up on in the future?
I had a student write a really interesting paper. I had a student who's an Andrew Yang supporter, and the student saw what's happening with COVID-19. He said it's happening, but no, I think it does set an interesting precedent. And I was amazed when I started reading these state statutes. Some of the states have already been providing checks to the workers. They're sending checks. They're sending temporary money while the workers are looking for new jobs. And I think that with some of this state precedent and this idea at the federal level now that sometimes you just need to send people money when they're undergoing a very difficult change in their lives, either because they've been told not to work because of a pandemic, or in this case, they've been put out of work because the state has said no more coal. And the job you've always relied on will no longer be here. So yeah, I think we need to look at states like New Mexico that have been working on this. There are also interesting examples from Germany here. Rhine-Westphalia was a big coal region. They involved the coal workers. Germany involved the coal workers in decisions about what type of community support are we going to provide to these communities that previously relied wholly on coal mines? What types of re-education do you want? What types of new jobs would you, the workers, like to move toward, so that when we provide funding for apprenticeships or retraining, it's the type of funding you would use and want. And I think that was brilliant to involve the coal workers in planning for that what is called a just or a fair transition. So great question. I like it. And I agree that COVID-19 is setting interesting new precedents. It's too bad that it has to be coming from such a dark place, but maybe we'll learn some positive lessons eventually.
Well, and we did not get to many questions. I must apologize to all of those of you who have entered questions and we didn't get a chance to get to them. This is the sign of a very successful presentation, a very stimulating one. Thank you very much, Hannah, for that. And thank all of you who dialed in and joined us today. I'm sorry that it's the end of our time, but I do want to encourage anybody who is interested in this further, to go to the Kleinman Center website. You can find a recording of this webinar on the site, along with the slides that Hannah presented. And you can also find a very interesting Energy Policy Now podcast with Professor Wiseman as well. My thanks to the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy here at the University of Pennsylvania for sponsoring this event. And of course, many thanks to Professor Wiseman. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Cary.